Now that's quite the pile of parts. This started off with the diagnosis of a creaking noise over bumps, and it led into this. Let's talk about it. Now, of course, for this diagnosis of the creaking noise that we had, I did a quick front end check. One of the first things that I found was I had an issue with the lower ball joint. That's this right here. You can see it attached to the lower control arm. Of course, you could go to 1AAuto.com and buy yourself the single ball joint, use a ball joint press it in and out. You might find that you still have an issue though. You really have to pay close attention whenever you're doing a diagnosis process. On lower control arms, you should also find that you have a couple rubber mounts. These are typically rubber bushings of some sort. We have one right along here, and then we have a second one. You can consider this a hockey puck bushing. It essentially is a circle right here, and it fits inside of this area. I can move it around quite a bit. It should not move around inside of here. A little bit of pivoting is okay because the control arm does need to be able to pivot up and down as you're driving down the road. But if you did find that you had an issue with the ball joint and either of the bushings, for me personally, it only makes sense to replace the entire control arm at the same time. You don't need any specialty tools in most cases, whereas if you were just doing the ball joint, you go ahead and replace it. You still have a creaking noise. You find that you have an issue with this bushing right here. Now you're just going to have to replace it anyways. This is going to save you some time and money. Now, of course, with our diagnosis, we didn't just stop with the first thing that we found. We continued on, and one of the other things that we saw that's right out in the open was an issue with our front strut assembly. On this one in particular, I found that I could see oil making its way down along this area, right behind the coil spring. If I was to lift up on this dust boot, which is very simple, I can see exactly where that fluid's making its way out, and that's from the seal on the cartridge itself, right down in this area. If oil's making its way out of that seal, more than likely the gas has too. At that point, as you're oscillating, going over bumps, or maybe even coming to a heavy stop or a hard stop, the front end of the vehicle is going to go down or dip. You might hear a creaking noise coming from this area. If you found that you had fluid making its way out, that's something that you're definitely going to want to replace as soon as possible. This can be a serious safety issue. You can buy just the cartridge and then leave the coil spring and then reuse the cap as well. Or you can buy the entire assembly from 1AAuto.com, and it's going to be a much easier fix overall. One thing that I would mention about this is if you're doing one side front strut assembly, you need to go over and do the other side of the vehicle as well. It only makes sense. You saw that pile of parts. This vehicle had a lot of issues. The next thing that we found that had an issue was our front CV axle assembly. On this one in particular, we had an issue with our front axle CV boot. Look at that tear. Inside that area, there should be grease. That's the lubricant for the joint. If you have a tear like this, moisture or debris could make its way inside the axle joint. If that's the case, you might hear an audible clicking noise during hard turns in one direction or the other while the vehicle's moving. If you hear that or see a rip in the boot, go ahead and replace that axle. Something else to think about during the diagnosis process is what other parts are going to have to be removed or dislodged to go ahead and replace that part. On this particular vehicle, on pretty much any of the parts that we've already talked about, you're going to have to dislodge them from your steering knuckle. So we have to pay close attention to that. A couple things that we'll pay attention to on that steering knuckle would be the backing plate first. You just want to confirm that it's not rotted, weak, or damaged. It's kind of a safety thing. You don't want anything making its way up and behind the brakes, potentially getting caught in there. Aside from that, if you happen to hear an odd howling noise while you're driving down the road or while cornering, it's more than likely a wheel bearing issue. On some vehicles, you're going to have a bolt-on wheel bearing. Other vehicles are going to have a press-in wheel bearing. If it's a press-in wheel bearing, it's going to go straight into that steering knuckle, and you're going to have a press for this. Not everybody has one of those in the driveway, so if you do need a wheel bearing on something that has a press-in wheel bearing, you might want to just go ahead and replace the steering knuckle. That's going to come with the backing plate and that wheel bearing. You can order it from us, and we'll ship it all out at the same time. Now let's talk about your brakes. It's one of the first things that you're going to see once you remove the wheel, so you really want to pay attention to your brake rotor surface. This is the braking surface here where your brake pads are supposed to go against. Typically, you can clearly see the outer portion, but as for the inboard side, there isn't much to see because you're going to have a backing plate. It needs to be disassembled to be thoroughly inspected, especially if you want to take a look at those brake pads and the brake caliper itself. Now, I've got some brake parts out over on the bench here for us to have a quick look at. This is the brake rotor on the back side. Look at this. It actually has a little bit of fluid on it, and look at that inboard brake pad. That's wet as well. Why would both of these be wet with some sort of fluid? Typically, that's going to come down to the caliper. The caliper itself has a piston in the center, and around that piston, it's going to have a rubber seal. The seal that you can see is the dust boot. The seal that would be the issue would actually be internal here. If this is leaking and you can see fluid making its way out of the dust boot, the caliper itself has to be replaced. Also, if you can see any type of fluid or miscellaneous debris on your braking rotor or on your brake pads themselves, you'd want to replace those at the same time as well. If you need something like this and you're replacing the caliper, go ahead and replace the pads and rotors at the same time. And of course, whenever I do something like this, I'm going to replace both sides of the car at the same exact time.